Welcome to the Food Revolution Summit, where we explore how you can heal your body and your world with food. I'm Ocean Robbins, and this next interview is with our guest, my dear friend, dietitian Brenda Davis. Brenda Davis is a world-renowned plant-based trailblazer and an internationally acclaimed researcher and speaker. A prolific writer, Brenda is best known for the best-selling Becoming Vegan books, which have become classic go-to volumes for people seeking to make a healthy plant-based transition. Overall, her books have sold nearly 1 million copies and been translated into 15 languages. Brenda has been lead dietitian in a diabetes intervention research project in the Marshall Islands, and she's authored and co-authored numerous professional and lay articles, and she is past chair of the Vegetarian Nutrition Dietetic Practice Group of the American Dietetic Association. She was the recipient of the 2022 Luminary Award at the International Plant-Based Nutrition Healthcare Conference. In this interview that you're about to see, we'll be talking with Brenda Davis about plant-based nutrition, brain health, how to harness the power of diet for vitality and radiance, the truth about weight loss, and the best real superfoods. Brenda, so great to be with you today.
Oh, I'm so privileged to be here, Ocean. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Well, I actually want to start with a big picture question, which is you've dedicated your life to educating people about the power of plant-based nutrition and how to do it in the right way so that they thrive. Why?
You know, it's a combination of things, but it's really, for me, about the big picture. It's about making choices as a human being that are conscious, that will make a difference in the world, not just for ourselves and for our own health, but for the planet and for the animals we share this planet with. And so I think from the time I was a very young child, I got the sensibilities of animals, as many children do. And as you grow up, you get desensitized. And there was a point in my life when I was in my late 20s, and I'm, be 65 this year. And I just realized that my choices were not consistent with my values. And I decided at that point that I would just make a dramatic change. And I was so fortunate that my husband was excited to do this journey with me. He had always wanted to leave a softer footprint on the planet. And that was really what propelled us. And I've never looked back. I was terrified, to be honest, when I first made the transition, because I was a registered dietitian and everything at my disposal was about the 4 food groups. And the top 2 food groups on the food guide at the time were meat and dairy. And I thought, how can I be a dietitian and be completely plant-based? How will this work? I will just be ousted from the profession. So I was nervous about that, but it turned out to be not a problem at all, because my colleagues really appreciated that I was developing guidelines for people that wanted to do this. They wanted people to get it right, and that was what it was about for me.
And then you went on to discover that not only was it not a big lack to be plant-based, because you were motivated by ethical concerns.
Yes.
But over time, you saw that it could actually be a benefit to people's health.
Oh, especially where chronic disease is concerned. And when you think about it, right now, 74% of the global population will die from a lifestyle-induced disease. And there is no diet that has a stronger impact on reducing risk of chronic disease than a well-planned plant-based diet or a high-quality plant-based diet.
And this well-planned and high-quality part is important too, because we've seen a lot of studies showing that vegetarians and vegans actually tend to live longer.
Yes.
And not have a lot of the chronic ailments that are common today.
Yes.
But when I was a kid, there was no plant-based junk food. Because there wasn't plant-based food in stores. You kind of had to do it was all DIY. And most stuff you can make in your kitchen is whole foods.
That's right.
But nowadays, there's plant-based everythings, or vegan everythings at least,
Yes.
that many of which are made in factories. And so, when I was a kid, a lot of the studies were first starting to be conducted that are now showing long-term vegetarians and vegans doing much better. But vegan junk food is not necessarily an improvement in terms of health outcome. And now you're also focused a lot on helping plant-based eaters do it right, plan it well, so that they can get those positive results.
Yes, and what's really interesting, Ocean, is that now there are a number of studies that are looking at something called the the plant-based diet quality index. And there's a healthy plant-based diet and an unhealthy plant-based diet index. And what they're seeing consistently is the healthy plant-based diet index, people that are following, and that means a diet that is predominantly unprocessed foods. And the unhealthy plant-based diet index is, predominantly processed plant-based foods. And so what we see is a dramatically reduced risk of obesity and a variety of diseases with the healthy plant-based diet index, and the actual reverse with the unhealthy. There was one study recently that showed, I think it was a 62% reduced risk of obesity for the healthy eaters and a 95% increased risk of obesity for those following the unhealthy plant-based diet index.
Yeah.
And it was the same for colon cancer. I think 55% reduction for the healthy and a 45% increase for the unhealthy. So it really matters what you're eating. So, you can have a bag of potato chips and a Coke and call it a plant-based snack. That's very different than having an apple and some almond butter. So we really have to get that.
All right, I want to talk a little bit about mental health, especially since the pandemic. We've seen this skyrocketing rates of mental health issues, addiction, suicide. New study coming out not that long ago showing suicide rates going up a lot. Especially among our young people. Mm-hmm. There's many factors that go into this, obviously. Mm-hmm. But nutrition seems to be one of them.
Yes.
Do you think that diet and lifestyle can play a part in improving our mental health?
Oh, absolutely. And like you say, genetics and, all of the social determinants of health factor in. But diet is a huge, huge player. And what a lot of people don't recognize is that every single cell of the body, including every brain cell, is a product of what we eat. This is our raw materials with which we build our brain cells. And when we put junk into our body, and what is junk? Well, essentially, we're taking often a processed carbohydrate, a processed fat, processed proteins, where the best example is white flour. You take a kernel of wheat and you remove most of what is of value to human health, and you're left with the endosperm of the wheat, which is mainly carbohydrate. And then before you eat the stuff, you add sugar and fat and salt and preservatives and colors and so on, and then you eat the stuff and you expect it to support brain health. It doesn't. There are certain critical nutrients that you need for brain health. And eating a highly processed diet is problematic. It affects your mood, it affects your mental health. And that's where eating real food is just so important. And when the exciting news is when you start to put in the raw materials that your body needs to rebuild itself, it happens so quickly. You can recover from illness and even from mental health issues fairly quickly when you start to put in the kinds of materials your body needs. And so that's the good news.
What are some of the key things that are helpful, compounds, nutrients, etc., that we can see are beneficial for mental health, and what are some good, healthy ways to get them in your body?
Yeah, so the things that come to mind for me are a number of things, of course, but you need to have enough nutrients and calories, and every nutrient will matter. But omega-3 fatty acids are really important. Omega-3 fatty acids are important because they're anti-inflammatory, but they also are the substrates for a variety of compounds like eicosanoids and resolvins and protectins. And these omega-3s are also, especially DHA, is pivotal for the cell membranes and the flexibility and permeability and shape and structure of these cell membranes. And so it affects our neurotransmitters as well. So it's really, these are structural materials for the brain. And even EPA is very important for preventing depression. So these long chain omega-3s are critical. Other nutrients that are really important for the brain, iron is very important for the brain because it supplies oxygen to the brain. So a lack of oxygen, especially during the formative years when we're very young, can cause irreversible brain damage. It can cause mood changes in adults as well. And then other nutrients that are really critical, especially for plant-based eaters, are vitamin B12. So B12 is so important to cognition because it helps us to build the myelin sheath around to protect our nerves. It's important for the neurotransmitters as well. So it's a very critical nutrient for brain function. And if we don't get enough B12, our homocysteine goes up. And that can cause cognitive impairment. So we need to be conscious of that. Iodine is a nutrient that's really important for the brain as well, especially because it actually helps with the development of the brain and nervous system. And so if when you're pregnant, you don't get enough iodine, it can actually cause a 10 to 15% drop in cognition of your child. Now, if you're severely deficient, it is the number one cause of severe cognitive impairment globally. So that's another nutrient that's important. Vitamin D is important. Vitamin E is important. Vitamin E is a strong anti-inflammatory nutrient. So vitamin D is, a lot of people don't realize, but it is a very important brain hormone, and it affects neurotransmitters, neurotrophins. It's just very important for brain function. So there are a lot of nutrients that come into play.
Okay, well, I want to talk about all of them. And actually, let's go over maybe quickly. Some of those are quick, some of those are not so quick. But let's go over quickly some of those that we can just cover fairly swiftly.
Yes.
So that's B12.
B12 is a nutrient that isn't naturally present in a lot of plant foods. It's possible to have little tiny bits if we ferment a food in a contaminated container, for example, or some seaweed may have some B12, but when we dry it, that B12 can be converted to inactive analogs. So we really need to recognize that plant foods are generally not reliable sources of B12. So there are two spots we can get B12 from: fortified foods or supplements. And fortified foods are reliable sources, but we would have to consume them on a regular basis. So for most people especially eating entirely plant-based diets, it makes sense to take 1,000 micrograms twice a week or 50 to 100 micrograms a day. Now, for seniors, you actually might want to boost it to 500 to 1,000 micrograms a day, or people on metformin. So that's B12, and it's not rocket science. It's not that difficult to get, and it's not expensive.
And I think there's research out that quite a few omnivores are deficient in B12 too, especially as they get older.
Yes, so actually the Institute of Medicine recommends that for anyone over the age of 50 years, you do not rely on animal products for B12. And the reason is simple. B12 is bound to protein in animal products. You have to be able to cleave it off the protein, and you need enough stomach acid, you need the enzymes to be able to do that task. And for many people over 50, you start to lose that ability, and up to 30% of people over 50 just can't do it. And so it's recommended that everyone over 50 relies on the same thing that vegans or plant-based eaters would rely on, and that's fortified foods and supplements.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
How about iron?
So iron is a nutrient that, many people would be surprised, but it's actually present in higher amounts in plant-based diets than it is in omnivorous diets. So the average omnivore might consume, 18 milligrams, maybe 20 at most, whereas vegans, it's usually around 22. And that's because dairy products in omnivorous diets have very little iron, and they take a good chunk of the calories, whereas almost all whole plant foods contain iron, unless you're eating a very highly processed diet that's not fortified with iron. But generally, we're consuming lots of iron, but the iron we consume is all non-heme iron. It's not heme iron. Meat will, at least some of the iron in meat is heme, some is non-heme. But heme iron is absorbed very rapidly, and that actually can be problematic because it can serve as a pro-oxidant, whereas non-heme iron tends not to do that. But non-heme iron, there are lots of things we can do to help with the absorption. Including a source of vitamin C with our food, including eating a lot of carotenoids, and sweet potatoes and carrots can help. Even eating garlic can help, and certain spices can help with the absorption of iron. So what foods in the plant kingdom provide iron? The legume family is really the predominant iron source. So beans and lentils are a wonderful source of iron, but even whole grains, some vegetables are pretty good sources of iron. Things like prunes, dried fruits, blackstrap molasses, all are reasonable iron sources.
Yeah, and then there's also the fact that some people are getting too much iron, and arguably more people are dying from excess iron than inadequate iron because of the oxidative capacities, particularly with heme iron. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so heme iron is a pro-oxidant, and it has been associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes and several chronic diseases. And so iron deficiency is the number one nutritional deficiency globally. And so it is a concern. Iron deficiency anemia is a concern, but an excess of iron is also a big concern. We don't see the excesses in people eating a plant-based diet very often, unless they have, 2 genes for hemochromatosis or something like that. But generally, we are better off. In fact, when you think about the iron in legumes, it's absorbed as we need it. The way that it's supplied is very different than heme iron, where it's just all, comes into the bloodstream rapidly. We absorb, the non-heme ferritin molecule, and then it's just released slowly into the bloodstream as we need it. And that really is a very good thing. And so that's just something to recognize. And iron generally is something that, we don't tend to necessarily need to supplement. But if you're taking a multivite and your iron tends to be a little low, your serum ferritin is low, you can take a multivite that does include iron, and that can be useful. And the one group of people that I would say we really need to be a little extra cautious with, 2 groups really. One is very young children. Toddlers love to eat starchy staples like pasta and so on. And their iron intakes can be on the low side, and that can affect their cognitive function. And for babies, I think including some iron-fortified infant cereal is a really good way to avoid an iron deficiency. Yeah. So that can be, and then the second group is menstruating women, because they're losing a lot of iron. They need to just be a little more conscious of iron intake.
Thank you. And it's an easy blood test to find out.
Yes, it's an
Very
easy blood test.
Yeah, thank you. What about iodine?
Iodine is one of the nutrients that I think is underappreciated in the plant-based world, particularly because iodine, most omnivores tend to get plenty of iodine from cow's milk and from fish, and their, eggs have some. So those kinds of foods. In the plant-based world, we're looking at, of course, iodized salt is a huge source of iodine. We added iodine to salt to try to prevent the cognitive impairment caused by a lack of iodine, and this was a very inexpensive way to provide it to the global population. Unfortunately, in the vegan world, we tend to get it from one of 2 sources, iodized salt or seaweed. A lot of people eating plant-based don't do either. So they'll choose, a sea salt that's not iodized. And seaweed isn't a food that most of us grew up with. In the Japanese culture, it's a very common food, but in ours, it's not. And so, including one of those 2 things or a supplement with some iodine can be really helpful. But there's a caution there, because a lot of the seaweed is so hyper concentrated in iodine that you can actually exceed your upper limit. And your upper limit is 1100 micrograms. Your RDA is 150. So if you have even half a teaspoon of kelp powder, you're above your upper limit. So for kelp powder, it's a 16th of a teaspoon. For a small child, for a preschooler, the upper limit is about 200 micrograms. And that is an 1/8 of a teaspoon would be beyond the upper limit. So, a 16th is 150 micrograms. So we just need to really be aware of how much is in seaweed. Now, nori is a different story. So you could eat, a sheet of nori or two and still be well within that RDA, well below the upper limit range. So even kids snacking on, these little packs of nori snacks, it's a very safe choice for iodine.
Thank you. You mentioned vitamin E, which isn't a huge concern on a plant-based diet, but it is helpful to mental health and brain health.
Yes, and so vitamin E can be a concern on a plant-based diet, and we actually see people eating very low-fat diets coming up falling short on vitamin E. And the reason is vitamin E is a fat-soluble nutrient. It tends to be the biggest sources are almonds and sunflower seeds and avocados and vegetable oils. And so when you cut all of that out on some of the stricter less than 10% fat diets, then you may fall short on vitamin E. So I would suggest just including some nuts and seeds in the diet at least to get enough vitamin E, because it's an important nutrient.
Got it. Thank you. Omega-3 fatty acids is a little more complex.
Yeah.
A study came out not too long ago finding that most vegetarians and especially vegans anyone who didn't eat fish really was low in it, but especially vegetarians. And specifically, they were finding that they were high in ALA, but low in EPA and DHA, concerningly low.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about ALA and EPA and DHA and the relationship between them, and then also where we get them from?
And this is such an area of interest for me, because when I wrote my first book back in 1994, I created guidelines for DHA, EPA, ALA. We actually had in Canada at that time recommendations for essential fatty acids. That didn't exist in the United States. Now we have a combined RDA for Canada and the United States, and we do have recommendations for essential fatty acids now. But back then we didn't, and so we were trying to develop something that would work for vegetarians. And so it's always been a key area of interest. And what people need to know is that the omega-3s in plants are in the form, they are the parent fatty acid, alpha-linolenic acid. And it's in chia seeds and flax seeds and hemp seeds and walnuts. Half of the fat in greens is omega-3, but greens are so low in fat that you would have to eat 20 or 30 cups of them to meet your recommended, intake. But the problem with ALA is the biologically active forms of omega-3 are EPA and DHA, so EPA and DPA is the next on the conversion line, and then DHA. And so those are the more biologically active omega-3s. And so if we're not eating any of those, and they're mostly in fish, we have to rely on our bodies to convert. And that requires some conversion enzymes, and it requires a number of factors in the diet. We have to get enough protein and enough of the cofactors that are responsible for conversion. And if we get a lot of omega-6s and not too many omega-3s, the omega-6s compete against omega-3s for conversion. And so that may depress our conversion. Smoking depresses conversion. Aging depresses conversion. Pregnant and lactating women tend to be more efficient converters because their bodies just know that they need to be prepared for pregnancy. And when you're growing a baby to make a brain, you need DHA, so the conversion is naturally better. But conversion tends to be slow and fairly, just inefficient, if you will. And so there's a question of whether or not vegetarians and vegans, because our intakes, vegetarians at least 30% lower amounts in the bloodstream than omnivores, vegans probably 50 to 70% lower. And so there's a question, would we be better off including a direct source of EPA and DHA? And when that question first arose back in the 70s and 80s, we didn't have a vegan DHA and EPA supplement. We had one company producing a microalgae-based EPA and DHA in gelatin. Now we have tons. There's just all kinds, and it comes from the same place fish get their EPA and DHA, microalgae. So it comes from microalgae, and so that is a source. And in my humble opinion, it makes good sense to be supplementing with it. We don't know for sure that we absolutely need it, and especially for children that are born plant-based and have never eaten fish and their conversion is really efficient. We don't know for sure. But just to be on the safe side, I would suggest including a supplement. Even for a child, maybe 100 milligrams a day or something like that. For a teenager, maybe 150 or 200. For an adult, I would be going for 200 to 300. Basically what you're trying to do is, you can see all the recommendations saying, eat 2 servings of fatty fish a week. Well, how much does a serving of fatty fish have? Well, it depends, but it might be somewhere between 5 and 1,500 milligrams of EPA and DHA. And so if we're trying to mirror that, say it's 2,000 milligrams a week, then we could take 1,000 milligrams twice a week, or we could take 200 or 300 milligrams a day, or something like that. But I think that's a reasonable amount. And as we age, our need may increase. We may want to do 500 milligrams a day. So to me, that it's a very reasonable option. Some people are saying, danger for prostate cancer. I've never seen a study showing intakes at that level would increase risk of prostate cancer. The links, the association, I think, is more with oxidized, cooked, foods that are rich in these compounds, and even in ALA, that may increase risk. But I don't see it being an issue at that level.
Thank you. EPA and DHA you're kind of using somewhat synonymously, and the body can convert in both directions. It can make EPA into DHA and vice versa, depending on what it needs, right?
Yes.
But do you think there's benefit? DHA is kind of the end of the line, so to speak. Maybe the hardest to get. So that's, most of the supplements are actually DHA, the algae-based supplements that I've seen on the market. But do you think having some EPA is also beneficial?
I think it is, especially for people that have depression, and they may want to take straight EPA. Now, a lot of supplements are a combination of the two. Mm-hmm. There are just tons of vegan supplements or plant-based supplements that have both EPA and DHA, and I think it makes sense. EPA is actually used more for the production of eicosanoids and resolvins. Resolvins and protectants are also made from DHA, but the eicosanoids are made directly from EPA, so that's very important. And if you have difficulty converting, then it just makes sense to have both, because retroconversion often can be inefficient as well. And the other point to make is, it's very interesting, there are a few foods that contain stearidonic acid. And the first fatty acid, essential fatty acid on the sort of the chain of elongation and desaturation, is stearidonic acid. So it's alpha-linolenic acid, then stearidonic. But stearidonic we can get directly from some foods like hemp seeds. And when you consume stearidonic acid directly, the conversion tends to be more efficient than it is from alpha-linolenic acid. So hemp seeds, I think, are an incredible food for plant-based eaters, because they contain a beautiful combination of essential fatty acids. They contain some stearidonic acid. They are very high in protein and trace minerals as well. And the quality of protein is excellent. You get from a quarter cup of hemp seeds about 13 grams of wonderful quality protein. So they are very good foods to include.
Wonderful. And quite delicious too, actually.
Oh, yes. And a really good addition to smoothies. So a lot of people add flax seeds and chia seeds to smoothies, but if you don't drink it right away, they get gluey and they're not that palatable to me when they're so gluey. Hemp seeds don't do that. Hemp seeds provide more protein, less gluiness. So they're a really good addition.
Yeah, and they also keep a nice texture. You can use them in casseroles and in oatmeal and all sorts of things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, lovely. Let's talk about protein. Big topic. Everybody who goes plant-based suddenly hears this question: where do you get your protein? Because, meat is considered protein. The industry actually tries to market it just with the word protein instead of meat because they want to have us associate that with protein.
Yes.
And protein has this kind of health halo. What's the story about protein? Do plant-based eaters risk not getting enough? Do they have benefit from not getting too much?
Yeah, so protein, for years, if you look historically, animal products have a health halo where protein is concerned because nutritional deficiencies used to be the biggest, the nutrition policy was based on the concern about nutritional deficiencies and animal products were seen as something that could help prevent that problem. And so they acquired a bit of a health halo, if you will, as you said. And the issue today is more about preventing chronic diseases that are killing most people. And we established protein quality based on two factors: digestibility of protein and amino acid profile. And so protein quality scores like the PD-CAS and all of these, the protein efficiency ratio and the biological value and all of these were really based on how protein in food would affect the growth of rats and mice, and they are fur-bearing animals. They need a lot of sulfur-containing amino acids, and so we overvalued the protein quality of animal products and undervalued the protein quality of plant foods for human beings. And in my opinion, we missed a huge part of the protein quality conversation, which to me is very much about how a protein source impacts your risk of disease. And I think we also need to factor in the impact of protein sources on the environment too in the conversation, because we need to be able to provide enough protein for all of the 8+ billion people on the planet. And so it has to be part of the conversation. But where protein quality is concerned, a couple of the things that I think are really important to understand is, we always say, or people often say, plant protein lacks certain amino acids, and that's not true. Every single plant protein has every single essential amino acid. And that's something people need to recognize. So it makes no sense to think we can't get our essential amino acids from plants. It's actually where they come from. And so when you eat a mix of plants, you eat a variety of plants, and you eat enough calories, generally you get enough protein, you get enough essential amino acids, and it's not a problem for most people. And in fact, on average, if you think about how much protein humans need, we need, it's estimated, our RDA is 46 grams for women, 56 for men. Of course, it depends on your healthy body weight, and you calculate it based on 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight. But generally, the average plant-based eater gets in the 70s, around 72 to 76 grams of protein. The average omnivore, it's closer to 100. We're all getting, omnivores probably 100% more than what they need. The plant-based eaters probably 50% more than what we need. So it really isn't as big of an issue as a lot of people think it is. Now, it doesn't mean it can't be an issue. It can be an issue for some individuals. And sometimes in the plant-based world, we have have a tendency to say that, I'm a physician and I've never seen a case of protein deficiency. It's non-existent. Well, it's true we don't see kwashiorkor in North America, which is a very severe protein deficiency. But we do see inadequate protein in diets. We see it sometimes in teenagers who go from meat and potatoes to French fries and or hamburgers and soda to French fries and soda when they become plant-based. So they may not get enough protein if they're eating junk food diets. People with eating disorders may not get enough, or illnesses may not get enough because they're not eating enough food. But also seniors may not get enough. And I have seen lately a number of seniors with this issue. I had one lady come to me saying, after I became whole food plant-based in my in my 70s, by my late 70s, my hair is falling out. I have an issue with my skin. It's thin and it breaks and it bleeds and I bruise easily, and I'm really frustrated. And I did a nutritional analysis, and she was getting about 35 to 40 grams of protein a day. And so I said, you're not getting enough protein. Let's boost it to 60 or 70 grams a day, and here's how we're going to do it. And she made that change, and she's now 83. Her hair isn't falling out anymore. She said her skin is so much healthier than it used to be. It's not breaking, it's not bleeding, she doesn't get bruising easily anymore, and she's just so grateful. But she's angry that none of her doctors suggested that she may not be getting enough protein. And she says, and doctors consistently say you don't have to worry about it in the plant-based world, and I'm not sure that that's really accurate. So, and in senior years, part of the problem is that you eat fewer calories, but you are able to metabolize foods less efficiently, and you don't absorb as many of the amino acids from foods. And so, or other nutrients for that matter. So you need a more nutrient dense and more protein dense diet than you might have had to eat as a younger adult. And so I think this is just something we need to recognize. For an older adult, you need a little bit more protein. So you want to focus more on the legume family and tofu and some of these highly digestible proteins.
So as far as a general rule of thumb, would it be good to aim for around 1 gram per kilogram of healthy body weight, or to translate that for the Americans who don't know what a kilogram is, 1 gram of protein, because protein's measured in grams,
yes,
per, say, maybe a half gram per pound of body weight, more or less. Healthy body weight, we want to distinguish, because if someone's obese, that doesn't mean they need to eat enough protein for that body weight necessarily.
Yes, and that's something that a lot of people don't know either, Ocean. It took some real digging to find out what the meaning of the RDA in terms of body weight was, because some people weigh 300 or 400 pounds. And if they were getting 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight, that would be a lot of protein to be trying to get. And so it really is based on a healthy body weight, and that's very subjective. So you kind of have to say to yourself, well, what weight do I feel is my healthy body weight? What weight did I feel best at? And then sort of go from there. But yes, that's a very important point. And going for, especially if you're a reasonably active individual, 1 gram per kilogram body weight is, I think, a very safe target for people. I don't think if you're eating a whole food plant-based diet, you don't have to worry about getting too much protein. And just to put this into perspective for people, we need about 10 to 15% of calories from protein as human beings. And almost all plant foods fall within, certainly veggie meats are about probably 40 to 60% of calories from protein. Legumes are, if we're talking about soy foods, they're probably 34 to 44%, protein. Other legumes, 20 to 30% protein. If we look at vegetables, they're 10 to 40% of calories from protein, non-starchy vegetables. If you look at grains, they're 7 to 17%, nuts and seeds about 8 to 14%. And then the only two categories of foods that can fall below that 10% would be fruits, which are about 2 to 10%, and starchy vegetables, which are about 7 to 12%. So if we're eating a sort of variety of all of those foods, we almost always fall, as do people in the blue zones, between the 10 and 15% calorie range. Mm-hmm. And so we're good, we're good. And you really are not going to overdo it if you're eating whole plant foods. So you don't have to worry, and you will come close to. I actually calculated my own numbers very recently, and I came in at 1.2 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. But I'm fairly small, so that is a reasonable place for me. And I'm very active as well, as I know you are. And so one is good for most people. For seniors, I would say 1 to 1.2 to prevent sarcopenia and some of the other frailty and some of the things that we see with aging. So yeah, just and really, what do we need? Probably 0.8 grams per kilogram body weight, but aiming for 1 is probably really reasonable. And actually, people between the ages of 1 and 13, the RDA is 1. It's 1.05 for toddlers and 0.95 for the older children. It's 0.85 during teens. So we're right in that ballpark.
Yeah. I think one time I was calculating as well, and I noticed I had a decided for 2 months to eat a completely whole foods diet. So I had no oils, had no added sugars. I didn't even have any flours during that time. I was just like, I'm going to eat whole foods and just see what happens. I felt great. But I also calculated the numbers, and my protein consumption did go up because I realized, well, if you're getting the same amount of calories, but you cut out oils, which have no protein, and added sugars, which have no protein, and all refined carbs, which tend to have very low, you just can't help it. If you're getting enough calories, you're going to get a lot of protein from whole foods.
I love that story, Ocean, because it's so true, and people don't recognize, but it's true. Oils, sugars, zero protein. They have zero. So it really is. If you're including those foods, it dilutes the protein, the total protein in your diet. And when you're eating whole foods, the protein will naturally be higher.
Let's talk a little bit about skin and hair and nails.
Okay.
We all want to look good. And, beauty is more than skin deep.
Yes.
And so I think, I'm interested in helping cultivate natural, healthy radiance from the inside out. And sometimes nutrients are important, certain nutrients, to the health of our skin and our hair and our nails. Yes. Can you talk a little bit about what goes into that? Absolutely.
And one of the most important is protein because our hair and our nails are protein. They're, keratin and we have, when you think about your skin, there's keratin and collagen and many types, probably 70 or more different types of keratins. And so these things are made of protein. And so if we don't get enough protein, one of the things that we see happen is we see our hair starting to fall out. And so it is an important nutrient in that respect, but there are a lot of nutrients that are very important. Fat is one of them, and not all fat is equal. So we want healthy fats in the diet, and the healthiest fats are fats that come from whole plant foods, like nuts and seeds and avocados. And those foods come packaged with a whole bunch of other nutrients that are also very protective for skin health. But fats help with, keeping our fat or our skin supple and moist and not getting too dry and keeping our hair shiny and all of those things. So that's an important consideration. And a lot of people eating whole food, plant-based diets really try to do very, very low fat. And I think you compromise the health of your skin and your hair and your nails when you do that. Another couple of nutrients that are important are iron and zinc. And iron, when you don't get enough iron, it's another one of the biggest causes of hair loss. But you have to remember iron is what's supplying oxygen to your tissues, and you need oxygen. And you get very pale in your skin when you don't get enough iron. So that's another important one. And then zinc is very important. It's at the outer layer of the surface of your skin, is really concentrated in zinc, and it helps protect you from sun damage, and it helps you heal from injuries and so forth. So it's another important nutrient, and it's one that can fall a little short in plant-based diets if you're not getting enough of legumes, nuts, and seeds, which pumpkin seeds are really good sources of zinc. And so adding a few of those I remember my really good friend said, my nails are really not in good shape, and what can I do? And I said, how about trying adding just an ounce of pumpkin seeds to your diet a day? She could not believe the difference it made in her nails. So it's an important nutrient. And then there are other nutrients like biotin and vitamin D that are important for keratin formation and renewal and so forth. And so those are important, and vitamin E as an antioxidant, and it's helpful too, and vitamin C that helps us form collagen, which is really important for the skin as well. So there are a lot of nutrients. Vitamin A is also a very important nutrient for skin and hair as well, and nails.
Thank you. Let's go a little deeper on collagen.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about its significance. And what you mentioned vitamin C, but just kind of high level, what are the compounds that are helpful for collagen formation in the human body?
So of course, to me, the ones that stand out are protein and vitamin C. Those are the big ones. And of course, you need antioxidant nutrients on all of those. But collagen formation, collagen is what is in the, all the connective tissue of the body. And so that's something that is a lot of people eating plant-based are concerned about, because we're not eating collagen directly. But we don't need to eat collagen directly. Our bodies manufacture collagen quite efficiently if we're getting enough protein, if we're eating enough vitamin C. And for me, those are the two key nutrients for collagen.
Some people are taking collagen supplements. Does that have any benefit?
To be honest, I've seen mixed reviews. Some people say it's just digested as protein and it doesn't make a big difference. And some studies are suggesting it may be somewhat helpful. There are companies now coming out with vegan collagen, that is collagen that's being manufactured. And so some vegans are taking this type of collagen. Some are just taking supplements that help with collagen formation. I'm personally not that concerned about it myself. I eat a healthy diet, I get enough protein, I get tons of vitamin C, and I'm not concerned about taking collagen. I don't think we need to do that.
Okay, thank you. Let's talk about diabetes, which has been a major focus in your life. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about why it became such an important topic for you.
Yeah, so diabetes runs on my father's side of the family, and almost all of his siblings had type 2 diabetes. He died of type 2 diabetes. And my dad was one of these bigger than life kind of people who loved to, if we were eating popcorn, it was a popcorn party. If we were eating tangerines, it was a tangerine party. I can remember sitting at the table after my dad had had an ileostomy, and he was told he couldn't eat celery. And I remember there was a plate with some celery on it, and he took a piece and he said, I would rather be dead than not be able to eat celery. Everything was important to him, and he ate big and he ate a lot. And so he suffered from heart disease, type 2 diabetes, which eventually took his life. And so it is near and dear to my heart. I tried, my dad to be fair, did make some changes, and he was told he had 3 years to live at one point, and he survived over another 25 or so by making some changes and by becoming more physically active. But in the end, he ended up on dialysis, and he ended up with issues. He had terrible circulation to his intestinal tract, and that's what actually ended up killing him. That's why it's so precious to me. And I know my risk is higher. I know if I didn't live the way I did, I probably would develop type 2 diabetes, as several of my cousins have, by my age. So it's
very important to you. Yeah,
it's very important, and also because I've worked with in the Marshall Islands with a population that has among the highest rates of type 2 diabetes in the world, and they're just the most amazing people. I love their love for life, their laughter, they're just such fun people, and they are really being wiped out by a number of things, but type 2 diabetes is just a really serious problem, and so it matters for so many people in the world.
So in the Marshall Islands, tell us how prevalent diabetes is, how many people have type 2 in particular, and then also tell us about the work you've done there and what you've learned.
Yeah, so the estimates for the number of adults between 20 and 79 is what has been assessed, tends to range between about 25 and 34%. So we see that, depending on what year they do it. So it's a really big chunk of the adult population. And pre-diabetes is certainly, I would say, the majority of so between type 2 diabetes and pre-diabetes, it would be the vast majority of people suffering. And so the work there was really about going in and doing a lifestyle medicine intervention. And we had 5 overlapping cohorts of individuals. And it was a randomized clinical trial. So this is, a high level of evidence looking at people who were given sort of the standard of care there versus people that received this very intensive lifestyle intervention, which was a high fiber plant-based diet full of antioxidants and phytochemicals and very whole food plant-based diet, and physical activity, an hour of exercise plus a little walk after every meal, and we did everything. We covered all the pillars of lifestyle medicine: sleep and substance use, and I mean, we didn't have to do anything with regards to connection because they are so connected to one another there. It's a small community, but just sleep and all of those kinds of things, and fresh air and getting outside and moving. And when I first got to the Marshall Islands, one of the things I noticed was people would take a taxi. It's a tiny little island, 3.5 or 3.4 square miles in area, but 30 miles long. You have beachfront. Wherever you live, it's almost a stone throw to beachfront on both sides of your property, and so I noticed that people would take a taxi, even if they were going a block or two, because taxis were 25 cents at that time, and if you didn't take the taxi, it was like a sign that you didn't have enough money to take a taxi, and so it was almost a status thing, and so walking was considered not cool. And so we had to try to do our best to change that culture and get people walking and moving, and to get healthy foods offered in restaurants and healthier foods offered in the grocery stores. But what we found was the transformation in health was just, it really stunned me, to be honest, because within a week, people were no longer constipated. Their cholesterol levels dropped. Within 2 weeks, the average glucose drops were about 75 milligrams per deciliter. We saw, people would say, my pain is gone, my head, the fog in my head is gone. Just things like that were so remarkable. And so yeah, it was really a wonderful thing to see. The big issue was that imported foods are expensive, fruits and vegetables are expensive. Most people eat rice and cheap meat and drink, high fructose corn syrup called luau. And so it's really hard for them. So we spent a lot of time teaching them how to grow food in earth boxes and that kind of thing, so that they could sustain a healthier diet and eat some whole grains rather than always the sticky white rice, and beans instead of the canned meats and so forth.
Amazing. And so heartening. And, if it can happen there where food is so hard to access, wholesome, healthy foods, it can happen just about anywhere, right?
Oh, and that's one of the things that I often say when you consider the barriers they face, the poverty and the lack of fresh produce, and they didn't even know what beans were, just the knowledge about nutrition. And if they can do it, to me, we have no excuses. It's so much easier for us. And many of them did succeed and continue to succeed. When I went back in 2017 to develop a curriculum for the public school system and to train the teachers to teach children about health and nutrition. And I was so heartened to see some of our participants who had maintained their diabetes reversal and who had convinced some other family members to go in that direction as well. And it's just a wonderful thing to see.
Thank you. Insulin resistance is a cornerstone of the diabetes process, type 2 diabetes specifically. Can you tell us a bit about insulin resistance and what causes it?
Yeah, so insulin resistance is really just your body's failure to respond to the insulin it's making. So our beta cells in our pancreas make insulin. The insulin attaches to receptor sites on our cells. And then when it attaches, it kind of sends a signal to these glucose transporters to hurry up and get to the gate so they can, help transport glucose, so the gates can be opened and the glucose can come in and be used for energy. And so what happens when our bodies don't respond to the insulin, or become resistant, if you will, or insensitive to the insulin, is that the sugar builds up in our bloodstream because it just can't get into the blood cells. And so when it builds up, our pancreas ends up putting out more insulin. We end up with this thing called hyperinsulinemia. And so our pancreas is working really hard to get this extra insulin out so we can keep our blood sugars in a safe range. But what happens over time is the pancreas starts to get tired, and it puts out a little less insulin, and then we end up with prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, and it increases our risk for heart disease and PCOS, or polycystic ovarian syndrome, and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. And all insulin resistance is not just about type 2 diabetes. It increases our risk for multiple diseases and for obesity as well. And so this is a huge, huge problem.
And so of course a lot of people are saying, okay, less sugar, because insulin resistance, can lead to sugar buildup of sugar in the bloodstream. Is that helpful?
Eating less sugar can be somewhat helpful, but what we know is that insulin resistance is really driven by overweight, especially overweight when we carry excess fat in our abdominal area, and particularly when it's visceral fat. So fat can be stored, at the surface of our skin, and that's called subcutaneous fat, and it's not as dangerous as visceral fat, which is fat in and around our vital organs. And so when we get a lot of this hard belly fat, the visceral fat, it causes the production of cytokines, which are inflammatory, and so it promotes inflammation. But so excess body weight in a consumption of a highly processed diet that's high in a lot of inflammatory compounds. But what this triggers, and in that physical inactivity as well, they trigger lipotoxicity, inflammation, oxidative stress, and dysbiosis. And lipotoxicity is really the kingpin. This is the driver of insulin resistance. And what it is it's when you're eating so much, you have to store the excess, and usually you store it in your adipose tissue, and we have really unlimited reserves to store extra calories in adipose tissue. Now, sometimes when our body's flooded with excess calories, we tend to store the excess we start to overwhelm those systems of storage, and we start to store it in our liver and in our muscle tissue, and then it can actually overflow into our pancreas. And what happens when we store fat in our pancreas is it kills beta cells. When we store it in our liver, it causes severe insulin resistance. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people get so focused on carbohydrates and sugars and cutting those out. But when you do that, you do nothing to get rid of lipotoxicity, which is really the driver of insulin resistance. And what you really need to do is get rid of processed foods, and you need to cut back on fat as well, especially unhealthy fats that really contribute to this lipotoxicity. So really what you need to do is eat less. You need to be in a caloric deficit so you can get rid of the excess fat that you're storing. And what is really good is some of the first fat to go when you start to do this is the fat that's stored in your vital organs.
A lot of people are practicing a ketogenic diet to try to address type 2 diabetes, and it does bring down blood sugar levels because there's no carbs coming in. What's your take on the ketogenic diet? And also, you've done some research on sort of comparing ketogenic diet and plant-based diet. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it just makes me sad, to be honest, because ketogenic diets were developed many years ago to treat refractive epilepsy, or epilepsy that doesn't respond to medication. And it's actually quite effective at doing that. But the problem with it is that it causes severe cardiovascular disease, and it causes a lot of issues for the children that are on those diets. It has tremendous negative consequences, and it does because it is a grossly inadequate diet nutritionally, and in fact, so inadequate that the U.S. best diets, when they compare all the different weight loss diets, it almost always comes up as the dead last in the healthy diets category because it's so grossly nutritionally deficient. It's deficient in all the nutrients that are provided by plants. Plants are sources of carbohydrates. The main nutrient in plants is carbohydrates. So all plant foods contain about 58 to 92% of calories from carbohydrates, with the exception of nuts and seeds, which are mainly fat. All of these healthy foods we've been talking about, fruits and vegetables and whole grains and legumes, are predominantly carbohydrates. And so keto diets, you can't be consuming very many of those when you're eating 5% or 10% of calories from carbohydrates and 70 or 80% from fat. And ketogenic diets for children with epilepsy are even higher in fat. But so you're eating a diet that's mainly fat. Well, fat doesn't have a lot of nutrients. And it doesn't have a lot of fiber, and it doesn't have a lot of phytochemicals or antioxidants or prebiotics or any of those things that we really need to promote and support health. So, the goal to me, you can lose weight smoking cigarettes. It doesn't mean smoking cigarettes are good for you. So a ketogenic diet does produce weight loss, and it will help to flatline your blood sugar because there's very few carbohydrates there. But to me, when you assess the value of a diet, there are two critical factors. One is that it's got to supply the nutrients human beings need for health and for renewal of all of our body systems. And it's got to reduce our risk of chronic disease. And keto diets fail miserably on both counts. And that's all there is to it. They fail miserably. Plant-based diets are the opposite. they supply nutrition beautifully, and they are the most effective diets for reducing risk of disease. So you don't want to adopt a diet that's going to increase your risk of death and disease. And we have you can see I'm passionate about this topic. We have all kinds of studies showing, there was a 2018 study that showed that people consuming the least amount or the lowest amounts of carbohydrates had a 32% increased risk of mortality. That's not something we want a diet to be doing. Now, people who were eating 50 to 55% were, had a sort of a good risk factor. People eating the highest carbohydrate intakes had a 23% increased risk, but that was only for people whose carbohydrates were coming from refined foods. So the unhealthy plant-based diet index, the people eating healthy actually had a lower risk. Healthy carbohydrates or whole food carbohydrates had a lower risk than those with moderate carbohydrate intakes. That tells us something. And so we consistently see when we look at protein sources, for example, we have 3 very interesting studies that have been looking at what would happen if you replace just 3% of calories from animal-sourced protein with plant-based protein. What would happen in terms of mortality and morbidity? And just to put this in perspective, 3% of calories from a 2,000 calorie diet, which is kind of the average diet, is about 60 calories. And 60 calories is about 1 ounce of meat. It's less than 1 large egg. So a large egg might be about, close to 80 calories. So you get the picture. This is a tiny amount of animal protein. You replace that with beans, for example, and you reduce risk of overall mortality about 20% or about 10%. And so imagine if it was 6% of calories or 9% of calories or 12% of calories, 4 ounces of meat with that a similar amount of protein from plants. You would be reducing, risk by 40%, and so it's just huge. And then many of these studies looked specifically at so what would happen if it was processed meat that was replaced, or red meat that was replaced, or poultry, or fish, or eggs. And the worst food was processed meat. It was about 34% risk reduction if you replaced processed meat in Dr. Song's study from 2016. And then the Japanese study that was, showed a 50% reduction when you of cancer when you replaced processed meat with plant-based protein. And consistent. Eggs were quite high as well. Red meat next, and the lowest were the dairy products and the white meats. But even those, a replacement was, dropped risk by a significant amount. So,
well, let's go a little further on that train then and talk about studies. And specifically, maybe I'd love to invite you to share with us one major long-term study, maybe the Adventist health studies, maybe the nurses' health study, maybe another one that's looked at a large number of people over a long period of time, looked at what they ate and what their health outcomes were like, and what you think that tells us.
Yeah, so I think the most interesting studies are the 3 studies that were done comparing similar health conscious individuals eating different dietary patterns. And so we have 3 of those. We have the Adventist Health Study in Epic, Oxford, which compared 5 categories of eaters. And what's interesting about these studies is they didn't compare vegans with Western people eating a Western diet. They compared people who were smoking the same amount, drinking the same amount, exercising the same amount, and were generally health conscious about their diets. So they weren't eating highly processed foods as much as the average American.
It's because they were at Seventh-day Adventists who have a health conscious tendency across the board.
Exactly. And so they compared vegans, lacto-vegetarians, pescatarians, semi-vegetarians, and omnivores. Same thing in Epic, Oxford. They did health food shoppers and different people that were more health conscious, same 5 categories. And then we also have studies from Taiwan that compared vegetarians, and they're near vegan because in Taiwan they don't use much dairy at all, with health-conscious non-vegetarians. And these were in Tsuchi, the Taiwanese health study and the Taiwanese vegetarian study. So we've been following these individuals since Epic Oxford since 1993, Adventist Health Study since 2002, and then the Tsuchi study since 2005 and 2007, the two, cohorts. And it's just fascinating to look at the results, because these are really comparing the diets. They're not comparing the exercise or the smoking or the drinking or any of that. It's comparing the diets. And what they found very consistently was the further you go towards whole food plant-based, the vegans had the lowest risk of almost all of the chronic diseases, then the lacto-ovo-vegetarians. There were a few exceptions with the pescatarians, but generally the vegans were doing the best. And just to give you an example, hypertension in Adventist Health Study 2 was 75% lower among vegans, 55% lower among lacto-ovo-vegetarians. Ischemic heart disease was about 25% lower among vegetarians and vegans. When we looked at diabetes, 62% lower in the Adventist Health Study 2 among vegans, 38 among vegetarians. And then in Epic Oxford, it was a little higher in the pescatarians, 53%, 47 among the
higher
vegans.
Meaning reduction level.
Yeah, reduction level. Reduction, 57% less. 53% less, 47 among vegans, and then a little less among the vegetarians. And we see this consistently. And in fact, in Tsuchi, they saw a 50% lower risk in diabetes for men and 75 in women for the vegetarians. And they found non-alcoholic fatty liver disease 20% lower, urinary tract infections 16% lower among the vegetarians. The kidney disease 50% lower in Adventist Health Study 2 among actually 52, but about half. And then cancer 19% lower among vegans and in the Epic Oxford, and 16% lower among in the Adventist Health Study 2, and 58% less breast cancer in Tsuchi in the Taiwanese study. So this is really consistent. They found 30% less depression, 40% less cataracts in Epic Oxford in the vegans compared to the omnivores. So just over and over again. The only exceptions, two exceptions, one was for stroke. And stroke was actually higher among the vegans and vegetarians, and especially among the vegans in Epic Oxford. But it was actually lower in the Adventist Health Study 2 in Tsuchi. So it was kind of, they weren't sure why the difference between these two, but they thought because the people in the Adventist Health Study 2 are very conscious of B12. And vitamin D, and they got they tended to get enough, whereas people in Epic Oxford didn't, and that may have made quite a difference there. And then the other one, and this is consistent across the board, vegans have a higher risk of osteoporosis and fractures like hip fractures, and the reasons probably are is because we have a lower body mass index, and so we're leaner, and leaner people have a higher risk. But also, we consume less calcium, less vitamin D, less protein. And those are nutrients that are consistently associated with better bone health. Now, people with a BMI over 22.5 in Epic Oxford didn't have a higher risk. And men tend not to have a higher risk, whereas women have a little bit higher risk than men. So that is the one thing. But everything else, the risk of chronic disease is so significantly reduced.
And just to be clear about what's so compelling here, all these numbers that Brenda's giving about reduction in risk for all these diseases, this is comparing populations of people who are already having similar lifestyles in every other way, and even the omnivores in those studies are eating a healthier omnivorous diet than the general population.
Yes,
so if you compare this to a standard modern industrialized diet, you'd see even much more dramatic.
Much more dramatic. And what's really interesting is everyone in these health conscious cohorts, omnivores or vegetarian, dies at about half the rates of the Western population, of the general population in their countries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, so osteoporosis, though, you've got us teased there, because that was the one outlier. Okay,
Yes,
we talked about all these areas where plant-based eaters are doing better, And then osteoporosis is the one exception. You talked a little bit about some of the reasons. For somebody who's hearing that, though, and they're thinking, oh my gosh, maybe a woman who's like, I don't want to get osteoporosis as I age. What are the things that can be done to mitigate that risk?
Well, number one, exercise. Because when you do weight-bearing exercise, you're telling your bones to stay strong. So that's hugely important, very, very important. Number two, get enough calcium. So a lot of people in the plant-based world think it's just everything au naturel and they'll be good. But I think it makes a lot of sense to just be really conscious about your calcium choices. And if you consume a non-dairy beverage, pick one that's fortified with calcium. And if you have, say, 2 servings a day of a fortified beverage or fortified non-dairy yogurt or whatever, you're getting 600 milligrams right there. Try to meet the RDA. If you're aiming for 1,000 or 1,200, just factor that in as you're making your selections. Leafy greens are a wonderful source of calcium, but some leafy greens are so high in oxalates that you can't absorb, like spinach, beet greens, Swiss chard. You're getting about 5% of the calcium from those greens. So they can't be relied on as good sources. Whereas other greens like kale and broccoli and many of the Chinese greens, you're absorbing 40 to almost 70% of the calcium. And that's higher than cow's milk. You absorb about 32% from cow's milk. So those are wonderful sources. Tofu is an excellent source. So there are lots of good sources. Almonds and sesame seeds. I mean, we absorb a little less, probably in the range of 17 to 21% from those foods. From legumes some legumes are a really decent source of calcium as well. So we just need to be somewhat aware. We can boost intakes again with, if we use any sugar. Blackstrap molasses is an incredible source of calcium and iron. So that can be a source as well. But using foods that, tofu that's made with calcium or fortified beverages, especially for small children and for older adults, that can make a big difference. And then getting enough vitamin D. I live in Canada. We don't make any vitamin D during the winter months. And probably from October to April or May, we're making very little, if any, vitamin D. We need a supplement, and I would suggest 1,000 to 2,000 IUs a day is probably reasonable for most people. The RDA is 600 up to age 70, and over the age of 70, it's 800 IUs. So 1,000 to 200, I think, is a really good place to aim for. And then, of course, vitamin K, and we need enough potassium and magnesium, and so these are all nutrients, zinc, and all of these nutrients are important to bone health. And even vitamin B12 is important to bone health. Vitamin A, we don't want to get too much, but we don't want to get too little. So they're all important nutrients. And I'll share my own story, because my mom was diagnosed with osteoporosis when she turned about 50. And so I thought, I should probably have my bone density tested when I was 50. And I think, as I said, I'm just about 65. So I thought I'll just see where I'm at. And I'd been vegan already for at least 20 plus years at that age. And I had, not been consuming dairy products. And so I had my bone density tested. And when I went in to get my results, I can still remember my doctor opening the chart and his jaw dropping, because my bone density was so high that they had to put an arrow at the top of the chart. It was between 2 and 2.5 standard deviations above norm for my age, and 2.5 standard deviations below norm for the age is osteoporosis. And so I was at the opposite end of the spectrum. My doctor was shocked. He couldn't believe that my bone density could be that when I hadn't consumed dairy products for so long. But I am conscious of my intake of those nutrients. I am conscious of physical activity, and I really believe that's what can make a difference. So I think it's important to recognize that we can have very healthy bones on a plant-based diet.
Some cardiologists are actually very concerned about buildup of calcium in the wrong places, in the arteries, right? So you want it in the bones, you don't want it in the arteries. What is it, when it's in the bloodstream, that causes it to get where you want it and not where you don't want it?
Well, and I have no idea. That is such a good question. Why it would deposit in your blood vessels. But we obviously, calcium is it's not just about building bones. Calcium, it really regulates so many body systems, and it's very important for the cardiovascular system. We need some, but to regulate every beat of our heart is dependent on calcium. And so we are going to have some calcium in our blood vessels, but we don't want an excessive buildup of calcium, because that is what leads to, hardening of the arteries, if you will. And so I think for some people, excess vitamin D could be part of the issue as well. But to be honest, that's a question that stumps me, why we would end up depositing so much in the arteries. But I would imagine, if I'm to guess, inflammation is a factor there. And so when the endothelium is not healthy, we don't get enough nitric oxide, we have too much inflammation, that drives that process of, building up calcium deposits. And so again, it's eating a diet that's anti-inflammatory and that doesn't promote oxidative stress. I think those are probably keys.
Thank you. My own sense is that it may be also that vitamin K2 plays a factor in that. And,
so that's a good point.
And that most of us can make K2 from K1.
Yeah.
But there's not really much K2 in a plant-based diet.
No, other than natto, which is not something
an acquired
most
taste.
of us. It's an acquired taste, and most of us don't grow up eating that. No, we don't. We get a ton of vitamin K1 from plants, from green leafy vegetables especially. But K2 we will manufacture. But if we've taken antibiotics and we can, the bacteria that produce K2 can be diminished. And I know it can also be produced in different places in our bodies as well. But I think for people that are at risk for osteoporosis especially may want to take a K2 just to have their bases covered. And there are lots of supplements that are a combination of vitamin D and K2, which may be very useful.
Great, thank you. Let's talk about soy.
Yes.
What's the truth? A lot of controversy about soy. Some people swear by it. It's the cornerstone of a healthy plant-based diet. Other people are like, no, soy causes cancer. It makes man boobs. It's got all sorts of problems. What's your take on soy?
Well, I'm passionate about a lot of things, but I'm passionate about soy too, because it upsets me terribly when we had a lot of negative press about soy that sort of came from a couple of places that were very meat-centered in their diets, and they created a lot of bad publicity about soy. We have so much evidence for the health benefits of soy. It's just overwhelming. So soy reduces risk of breast cancer, reduces risk of prostate cancer. It probably reduces risk of endometrial cancer and colon cancer. It reduces risk of cardiovascular disease and kidney disease. It reduces possibly male pattern baldness. It reduces symptoms of menopause. There are just so many advantages. It really is a very healthy. Soybeans are a healthy food. They've been a traditional part of the Asian diet for millennia, for thousands of years. They are a staple in 2 of the 5 blue zones. If they were so dangerous and so toxic, they would not be a staple in the traditional Okinawan diet and the Adventist diet. So there are so many reasons. To me, that's a real acid test. And so I think soy has a lot in its favor, and we have a ton of evidence suggesting that it's a really healthy addition. And one of the reasons it upsets me that so many plant-based people think it's like, don't eat it, is that it provides a wonderful food, a versatile food. So tofu and tempeh can be great replacements for meat. Soy milk is a high protein, high nutrient dense replacement for cow's milk. It's higher in iron and a lot of minerals. And so it's a really good food. If we, and tofu's low in fiber, so it can help to provide that highly absorbable, digestible protein. It's a high quality protein. So it's a really, really wonderful food. Edamame and tofu and tempeh and these foods. Now, one of the downsides would be that a lot of soy is grown with, sprayed with glyphosates. And so the non-organic products, but to be quite fair, most of the non-organic soy gets fed to animals. And so people that are consuming animals are directly consuming the inorganic soy, indirectly consuming it. A lot of the plant products that we consume are organic soy, or a lot of the non-organic, say non-GMO, right, on the label. So we have a lot of options for our choices, and I would suggest choosing organic when you can. Now, there are some products that are fairly highly processed, like veggie meats, for example. But in my view, veggie meats have been shown in scientific studies to have advantages compared to. So you always have to say, well, compared to what? And compared to meat, they're definitely better. Compared to legumes, maybe not as good. But in some instances, these are lower fiber, very high protein foods. And for some people, for example, older adults that may need to get that higher digestible protein, that could be a really nice, easy thing for them to cook up for dinner. Can be great for athletes who, can afford a little extra sodium and need a little more concentrated protein sources. So I think there's a place for these foods in the diet. But generally, when you're eating soy, you want to be choosing more of those first generation soy foods like the edamame and soybeans and tofu and tempeh and so forth. I think they're wonderful foods. I include them in, and I didn't even mention this. There was a recent study, 2022, that showed that they improve cognitive function. Soy foods improve cognitive function. And there are some studies suggesting they improve skin health as well. So I think it's good.
You talked about first generation. There's not anything more first generation than actually eating soybeans. And
Yes.
I've recently been, they take a long time to cook.
Yes.
But we sprout them. We soak them and start them sprouting for a couple of days. Not like fully sprouted, but they just start to get more bioavailable, and then pressure cook them.
Yes.
Doesn't take that long. And then I make baked beans with them and other things. And they're a very pleasant bean. They're actually very mild flavored, and you get all that incredible nutritional value.
Oh, that is such a good idea. And you can make patties with them. There are all kinds of things. And I love that you're doing this long soaking. I do this with beans a lot. The only thing, if you're doing the long soaking, is you might want to rinse to make sure you don't get any growth of pathogenic bacteria.
Yeah, if it starts to smell moldy, then it's probably not a good idea.
Yeah, exactly. So you're just wanting to rinse a couple of times at least a day and give fresh, make sure that there's fresh water when you're soaking, and then when you're sprouting to rinse them plenty.
There were some studies that came out in the last few years about soy oil.
Yes.
They were done on mice, and humans are not mice, but they did raise some concerns about soy oil potentially being linked to Parkinson's disease and neurological problems. And I'm curious if you have thoughts about soy in the human body, soy oil specifically, and whether that's something you may want to avoid.
Yeah, I think the study was very intriguing. But as you said, you can't necessarily assume that you can just take the data and say that exact same results would occur in humans, because we can't do that. A couple of things about that study that I thought were interesting. One was that so they compared the animals that were consuming about 40% of calories from coconut oil versus those consuming about 40% fat that was half coconut oil and half soy oil. And so you're talking about a diet that's very high in fat, and 20% of calories from soy oil would be a lot of soy oil. And so that's one factor. And the other thing that I thought would be really nice to know is what in soy oil may have caused the issue. And they didn't find the culprit. And that, I think we need a lot more research to see, well, what could it be? I mean, my thinking would be, how heavily processed was the oil, and was it subjected to really high temperatures? Were there products of oxidation there that could be problematic? But generally, my take is, the one thing that concerns me a little bit is when you look at infant formulas. So infant formulas would be, over 50% of calories from fat, because breast milk is 50 to 65% of calories from fat, and they're trying to mimic breast milk. So if the predominant oils, usually you've got palm oil and then some other unsaturated oil, if that second oil is soy, that could be 20% of calories from soy oil. And that I would be a little cautious about until we know more. It's just a little red flag there.
Yeah.
But otherwise, I would say generally you don't want to be, most of the soy oil in the diet comes from highly processed foods. Those aren't foods you want to be eating anyway. Generally, if you're using oils at home, I wouldn't recommend soy oil or any of the super omega-6 rich oils, sunflower, safflower, grapeseed, all of
corn
those
oil's way up there on omega-6.
Yes, exactly. And all of those are pretty high, unless they're high oleic sunflower or safflower oil. Otherwise, they're very high in omega-6, and grapeseed is very high in omega-6. Now, it's not that omega-6 is bad. Omega-6 linoleic acid is an essential fatty acid, and we need it. The only reason I would suggest not using those oils as a primary oil is because we're trying to balance omega-3s and omega-6s to improve conversion in a plant-based diet. Not that omega-6s are terrible in any way. It's really just that. And so we would want to put a lid on the omega-6s a little bit and have the omega-6s come more from whole foods, like our seeds, for example. Seeds are rich sources of the essential fatty acids. And so instead we might want to choose oils that are richer in monounsaturated fats, like an extra virgin olive oil or an avocado oil, or an omega-3 rich oil, like a hemp seed or a flaxseed oil. We don't cook with omega-3 rich oils, but in a salad dressing or something. And generally, if you cook with oils, you don't want the oil to smoke, because then you're producing products of oxidation that can be damaging to health. So you're wanting to keep the temperatures down. And so that's, I would suggest, generally, if you're eating a good whole food plant-based diet, you're not going to be getting much soy oil anyway.
Thank you.
And I wouldn't say that you have to avoid it like a plague. If there's a little bit in something, I wouldn't think it's a big issue at all.
A whole other topic as we wrap our time here today, self-love. And how can eating consciously be an expression of love for ourselves?
Oh, in so many ways. What we're really talking about is mindful eating and thinking about food sort of beyond just its nutritional content, thinking about food beyond even ourselves, thinking about when we purchase a food, the consequences to the people that grow the food, the people that package the food, that transport the food, where it's really coming from, and appreciating our food in a really profound way, and recognizing that when we're choosing to eat a plant-based diet, we're not contributing to the pain, suffering, and death of billions of creatures. we are slaughtering, 70 or 80 billion creatures, not including any creature that comes from the ocean. That's just land animals every year on this planet. And it is just so, to me, it's unjustifiable is the word that I would use. We're intelligent enough, we know enough not to contribute to that kind of suffering in other animals when it is not only unnecessary, but we're actually undermining the very life support systems that are necessary for life on this planet. And so to me, when we make mindful choices, we're supporting all of that. And we're also the self-love, when we recognize how vital our food is to every cell of our body, and how we are what, we say we are what we eat, or we are what we absorb, as Michael Clapper would say, which is so true. When we eat food that was grown and prepared with love, it makes such a difference in the expression we have of love, and we prepare food for our families with love as well. And that, I think that is one of the most important parts of family connection, is our food. And family meals are so critical. Do you know that family meals were found to be a bigger predictor of success in our teens than anything else, than school or church or sports or anything else.
Economic background.
Yes, economic background. So these are really important. Just really important points as we move forward in our choices as human beings, that they just have such profound consequences.
Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you, Ocean.
We've been talking with dietitian Brenda Davis, million-copy best-selling author, plant-based dietitian, and one of the kindest and wisest humans I've ever known. Thank you so much, Brenda, for your leadership, for your generous heart, for your scholarly learnings, and for sharing your wisdom with us today.
Well, thank you, Ocean. I am just profoundly grateful to know you, to be your friend, and for everything you do. You are impacting so many lives, and you do it with such brilliance and such grace and such compassion. I love the Food Revolution Network so much, and thank you for what you do.